So there's going to be an official debate happening between Therapist and Spaz. Therapist is taking the position that Japan never had a chance winning World War II, and Spaz is taking the opposition. The winner will be decided on a voting poll at the end. You can only vote if you've been through the debate for at least 75%. With all that said, you can carry on.
Thanks. So I'm gonna be the first one to open up. So my position is that looking at Japan's position at that time, when they went into World War II, they never had a chance of winning it. Their opponents at the beginning, or their main opponents, were America and I'd say Russia, because at the beginning they attacked Russia, and Russia they did counter a bit, but they mainly focused on Germany, and Japan then later on focused on the USA. So my pretty much my thickest argument is that Japan never stood a chance because they didn't have resources that they needed. They didn't have oil, they didn't have rubber, they didn't have any precious ores which they could make to metal or so for their production. They had to go and hunt that in other countries like China or the Dutch East Indies. So just based on that, they didn't have a chance. Also, the other countries had way more resources and way more people to use in their war effort. And I'll close my opening statement with that.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to go ahead and agree with you. I don't think at the start of World War II that there's really any way of winning a total war against the United States and the Soviet Union at the same time. I don't think that that's possible. You have like two superpowers. You're not going to be able to do it. But my contention is that I don't think Japan necessarily has to put itself in that situation. If you want to look at the situation right before Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, of course, the United States is technically not in the war at all. And at this point, I think Japan has two possible paths to what I would consider victory. The first path would be for Japan to go all in with the German strategy against the Soviet Union. I think this is actually like a source of division at the time, was that Hitler wanted sort of a pincer move against the Soviet Union. He wanted the Germans to attack from the west and the Japanese to attack from the east. He didn't want to declare war on America at all yet, which some people say that there are reasons why Japan chose to go against this strategy historically, but it seems like it would have had a fairly reasonable chance at taking out the Soviet Union. And then the only way for the Axis to lose the war at that point is for the Americans to go ahead and break their isolationist policy and enter the war by choice. The other possible strategy that I think Japan has for winning the war, even though this is a little bit less conventional, is to sort of effectively sort of cut Germany out and go ahead and sort of with the Japanese, at least possibly, can pursue a strategy of actually the strategy that Japan had before, the sort of strategy that we see Japan had actually war gamed against the United States earlier, which was just sort of I think they called it like interdiction maneuvers. They would just use submarine warfare and other sort of stalling methods to declare war against the United States, but instead of trying to go all ahead with Pearl Harbor, they have an option of just making the war as expensive for the United States as possible. Instead of going the total war route, they have the option of just sort of drawing things out, trying to destroy American morale. And then if things go right, it's possible that the Anglo-Soviet split is going to happen before either party can actually invade Japan, which Japan also has a really good defensive strategic position. Like Japan is a really hard place to invade, especially if you don't have nuclear weapons. And so there's actually a pretty good chance that if Japan plays its cards right, they can just ride out the war basically and wind up keeping at least some of their territory or some of their sort of colonial acquisitions in East Asia. And so the way I see it, just to recap, I think there's at least two possible strategies that the Japanese could have taken with more foresight that would have led to at least, if not a complete unequivocal victory, could have at least led to Japan being sort of on the right side of the Second World War. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I have some arguments to that. So first of all, do you know what the main goal for the whole attacking China, going to the Dutch East Indies was about? It wasn't just about the resources, it was also about they wanted to gain a big sphere of influence
No,
in
prosperity.
their territory. Well, yeah, they just wanted to have all the islands and a part of China. That was what they want. Um, Also, I wouldn't call winning World War II if you don't really have an enemy to face. Because if we see the winning parties, which are the NATO veto powers, USA, France, Great Britain, and Russia, China coming because of certain other reasons. Those countries all were on the winning side, and that's what made them the so-called veto powers. Also, the atomic bomb was used to decrease the numbers of deaths that would have
Okay.
come if they did a
But
if they did
just
a yeah if they did a
yeah.
land-based invasion.
Okay, but just real quick, Japan is like considered to have been on the winning side of World War One. But during World War One, Japan basically did what I'm suggesting in my second scenario here. Like they weren't really involved in much of the fighting at all. They joined towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's just say, I mean, also everybody says that, like, say Great Britain and France, like they won World War II. But if we look at what actually happened, their position afterwards is much weaker than it was beforehand.
True.
So if
I
we're
agree
talking
with
about,
you.
yeah, if we're talking about a country that can actually increase its territorial holdings during the war at the expense of the Allies, and then sue for peace, taking advantage of the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, which, of course, by the end of the war, it's pretty clear that the biggest concern of the US is going to be the Soviet Union and vice versa. Like,
Mm-hmm.
neither country is going to have the resources, is going to want to spend resources doing like a land invasion of Japan.
I have two questions to that.
Okay.
So if we're going the route that Japan never had that big face-off with the US and just tangled away around China, not really getting into with Russia because that's what happened, really,
Okay,
historically,
let me just be a
they
little
would have
bit more
had a
clear.
bigger military.
Okay, if it's cool, I feel like it might be a little bit of confusion. So let me just be a little bit more clear about what I'm proposing for scenario 2. So for scenario 2, let's say that Japan, instead of going the aggressive route, instead of attacking Pearl Harbor, which has a bunch of, like, the biggest problem with attacking Pearl Harbor is, like they were talking, like there's a famous saying about waking a sleeping giant. Now,
Yes, that's what I wanted to quote too.
Yeah. So my view is that if Japan doesn't attack Pearl Harbor, if Japan doesn't create this sort of this massive like morale issue, this massive like outrage in the American public, then the war between Japan and America isn't necessarily going to be a total war. Like, and the other thing is that we know historically that the attack on Pearl Harbor, some people say this is just unlucky. Some people say that Roosevelt baited the Japanese, but they didn't actually manage to take out any of the American carriers,
Yeah, I
which
know.
that's also ironic because by the end of the
It was
war,
the
the
main goal.
carriers were pretty much the whole point of naval warfare. So most of the ships, the battleships that were destroyed in Pearl Harbor, were actually obsolete by the end of the war anyway.
Yeah.
And so if we look at the cost benefit analysis for Pearl Harbor, we're just looking at enraging the American public for not nothing. I mean, there's like strategic momentum, but there's not a whole lot of benefit, right? And so let's just say the Japanese forego doing that. They can still declare war against the United States, but there's going to be a lot less. There's going to be a lot less will on the American side to either use nuclear weapons or to launch a ground invasion of Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that point, it's going to be more of a question of, at the end of the war, what colonial holdings can Japan keep, if any? And in my view is that if Japan can keep some holdings, like say if Japan can keep Korea, can keep parts of China, maybe probably not the Philippines, but let's say let's say that the result of World War II is, of course, Germany is destroyed like historically happened, but let's say that Japan has, we could even say that it's a conditional surrender, but let's say that Japan ends the war with more territory than it begins with. It might be reasonable to say that, well, at least that's a positive outcome for Japan. We can call that victory.
Okay, I agree to a little bit, but something I'd like to point out, which I don't know if you've gotten that already. If we go at the Japanese people's mentality, surrender is worse than death. Just going to a optional surrender or a optional we're going to the table is not an option in any if in a war, in a fight, because if it has to do with the Japanese culture. Also, if Japan wanted to go in participating in anything of the war, they did have to invade some other country. And if we're going this hypothetical way, at some point, maybe China would have gotten its shit together and maybe wanted retribution. Same with the smaller islands. So we can also go that route, and then I don't think it would be a so-called victory. Sure, it may be in your scenario, it may be a positive outcome, but the after effects are unknown, which doesn't which can't guarantee it being a lasting victory.
It might not be a lasting victory in the really long run. But let's just say that. Well, let's just say that we're going by the standard of. Let's just say that we're going by the standard of how the Japanese did in World War One, which is considered standardly to have been like a victory. Or let's even say that we're holding it against like the British or the French standard.
Mm-hmm.
I think Japan can easily do at least that well. Or not easily, but Japan has a reasonable shot at doing at least that well if they pursue what I'm calling strategy 2. Would you say that's fair?
we can take the standard, but it still makes winning a winning scenario of Japan very unlikely and very hard.
Okay.
Um, in any way, because just at my core argument, they themselves have no resources. They have to go to other places. They get sure that was the whole point of them going to war, them going to pick some islands or so.
Well,
But
so
any
they
islands that had some sort of resource or any territory was held by some country that had an alliance with a bigger country. Um, so
right. Well, so in my scenario,
it
they
always
are.
can have been
I just
conflict.
want to be
Also,
clear.
you've yeah.
So
I'd
my
like to grab quick up some
okay.
one of your arguments. You said that at the end, at one point, that the Soviets and the Americans wouldn't care about Japan, but that scenario also includes that Japan never really lost all its power, its military power, and it having some small gains in territory and resources. That would make Japan a very formidable enemy. Just I because I won't deny that the quality that they had of certain things was top notch. If you go at the Yamamoto class battleship or the um, Shokaku aircraft carrier class or the Taiyo class, which later then showed up, they had some good quality. That was and I would think that was the main issue in historically seen with both Axis powers in World War II, them going over quality than quantity, which Russia and USA both that was their element. In Russia producing the T-34 and the Americans producing the M4 Sherman as tank examples. Those were massively produced, easily repairable, easy usable. Japan and German, they over engineered things. But yeah, um, do you have like any other scenario that would make that could be more possible to give the Japanese a win?
Yeah.
But mm,
We can go to that, but let me just finish by saying, so just to be clear about what I'm proposing here, this is a strategy that's going to diverge from history around the time that Pearl Harbor happened, right? So we're still proposing we're still proposing that the Japanese are going to like attack colonial acquisitions and attack holdings of the imperial of the like European powers in Asia. But we're just proposing a different strategy against America. And the reason why I think Japan has a reasonable chance at coming out on top here is because it seems like the sort of split between the US and the Soviet Union is inevitable. And once that happens, if Japan still has a reasonable amount of military power, then they can align with either side or they can remain neutral. And it seems like it's going to be a much harder sell to talk about going to war or to talk about sort of finishing the war or going to a land invasion of Japan.
if
So,
you said you diverge by Pearl Harbor,
yeah,
side fact, something that that contradicts it. They attacked China and the whole Indies, or not the Indies. The Dutch East Indies came after Pearl Harbor, but they attacked China first with the Russian battlefield, which they had. Um, that came before Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is like that is the point of them engaging with the U.S. and getting to the Dutch East Indies. That was Pearl Harbor was pretty much to somewhat get the USA's attention away or somewhat away of the Dutch East Indies to get them free. They don't have to use so much power to get to the Dutch East Indies, which do have some they have some oil, which the Japanese need, to fuel their big war machine, their big war effort.
Right. So that's why I'm talking about. The reason why I say that's when I'm diverging is so you can know that I'm not talking about changing any of that. I'm just talking about a different war strategy against the United States.
But
But
going out at the United States in any way or form without it being peaceful isn't possible because the U.S. is pretty aggressive if we look at it historically. Even though we're in a hypothetical scenario, we still have the information historically in the real world where the USA is shown to be quite aggressive when it comes to any provocation. If I can take as example, in the First World War, I think, yes, the Germans had the magnificent idea of sending a telegram to the Mexicans asking them to attack the Americans. So that provoked them, and that was also a further reasoning of of ending up or joining the World War One.
okay. So can we agree that what I'm talking about here, I mean, we can say it's kind of a long shot, but it's at least a possible situation. Like it's at least a possible solution. And then we can just sort of move on to the other scenario.
Yeah, I can agree with that scenario about the 70%, but still the likelihood of them winning in that formal way, or that even being called a real win or victory, is be, is also what I'd like to add to that is France and England participated really in the war, which does give them the right to be called at the end winner. So if your hypothetical way is going less violent and not so much war,
Well, it's still a
I
war. It's
personally
just not a total war.
true, but any war with violence is for me automatically going into the same category. I like I make the split in non-violent war, no weapons, no punches, no death, and violent war with death, bombs, whatever.
I guess. So I guess we can go ahead and move on to the other scenario that I proposed,
Yes.
which is let's say that Japan and Germany, instead of declaring war or instead of attacking the United States at all, we can say that Japan and Germany around 1941, I think, when Hitler attacks the Soviet Union from the west, Japan can also attack Siberia from the east. They don't declare war against the United States at all. And in fact, they do everything they can to keep the United States out of the war for as long as possible. It seems like in this situation, especially with, let's say, a reasonable amount of luck on the German side, too, which I think it might be fair to use luck. We can at least propose things going a little bit differently. That they have a pretty good chance, actually, at knocking out the Soviet Union and effectively ending the war right then.
I have two questions to that. First of all, where is Japan taking its resources? And second of all, I personally think that Russia's even against Japan and Germany naval battle scene, Russia would have been pretty fucked, to be honest. But what at that point, Great Britain and the USA are somewhat allied with Russia. The USA is sending supplies to Russia. Also, as the Germans progressed, they had the wrong equipment, and Hitler said push, push, push. Um, that stopped them, and the whole production was laid to the east side, more to the Japan side. So, um, personally, uh, you could also say Russia just could have put some resources into the West Front against Germany, keeping them at bay and pushing everything else towards Japan on a land based. Also, Russia having way more resources, also being supplied by the UK and the USA, winning at the end against Japan, pushing them back, maybe gaining some territory in China, and then putting their full force, like they did historically, against the Germans.
Right. Okay, so on the resources point, as far as I understand it, what I'm talking about here is pretty compatible with sort of with Japan trying to acquire resources from, like, say, China, which is what they historically did.
Yeah.
Or actually,
totally
even,
agree.
well, the Russians are probably going to go like scorched earth, but at least possibly we can talk about capturing oil fields in Siberia, like Command and Conquer style. I don't know, but the point here is that historically, Stalin was actually really worried about Japanese aggression in the East. Like, that's why there were so many Russian soldiers. There were actually a lot of really experienced Russian soldiers in Siberia before Hitler attacked that were able to go west after, because the Japanese didn't really press any offensive against the Soviet Union. Like, they had some sort of early defeats, and they never really tried anything else. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't have been able to, at minimum, prevent the Soviet Union from organizing as effectively against Germany. And like we were saying, the Japanese naval power is probably going to be pretty dominant over the Soviet naval power, just like it had been before, or just like it had been in like the Russo-Japanese War. So the Soviets aren't actually going to be that much of a threat to Japan proper. They can afford to be pretty aggressive. And you also might be a little bit underestimating the amount of isolationist sentiment that there was, or even not necessarily even isolationist, but even like pro-Axis sentiment that there was in the United States. Because even though like Roosevelt definitely wanted to intervene in the war, there was a pretty big faction of Americans who were pretty strongly against it. And even if there's no way of actually keeping the US out of the war, it's not necessarily a sure thing that the United States enters the war in time to stop the Soviet Union from falling. And my opinion is that if we have the Soviet Union falling, then the actual the historic Allied victory is pretty much going to be off the table. But we're not necessarily going to see like Man in the High Castle, like Japan and Germany just split the world up. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. But without the Soviet Union, there's not really going to be much possibility of like an Allied ground invasion of Europe. And so the best case scenario for the Allies at that point is just going to be an eventual like armistice. It's not going to be actual like victory the way it happened historically.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, you say it's gonna be, it would be an armistice, so it's not really a victory. Also,
for all intents and purposes, if you conquer a piece of territory the size of the Soviet Union, and then
I would call that a victory.
Yeah, that's clearly a victory.
But I think you're underestimating the USSR, very much. Also, I'd just like to mention it's strongly in my opinion that if the Germans and the Japanese would have done that pincer move and they've pretty much taken over the world, which Germany would have done, well, they probably would have taken more and more and more. At one point, they would butt heads with the Japanese. And at that point, I'd opt for the Germans to win against the Japanese because let's say Russia is a very big country. They divided into two, with about like yeah, so some resources going to or more resources going to Germany and some to Japan. At that point, Germany has way more resources. Also has better equipment against the Japanese. The Japanese may have had an excellent fleet,
Okay,
but
so
their land-based military lacking very much.
yeah, so I agree with you on that point. I think that might be part of the reason why the Japanese didn't do what I'm talking about. But that I don't think that what you're talking about is exactly inevitable. Because let's talk about this alternate history. Let's say that the Japanese do what I'm proposing, and let's say that the Soviet Union falls. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the UK is going to fall. The UK is still going to be there. And the United States is probably going to be supporting, well, is definitely going to be supporting England at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to have at least three sides, or we're going to have at least three sort of power blocks still there. And even though Japan is going to be the weakest here,
Yeah.
it's not, well, it's not like a Risk where you just take over a bunch of territory and then you start getting troops from that territory and just like snowball, because it's going to be pretty, well, it's going to be pretty much impossible. I don't think anything like that's ever been done for the Germans to just like take over like all of Europe and half the Soviet Union and North Africa and just administer that, and then still have the like logistical abilities to keep conquering territory to the east. Like that just can't happen. The German logistics were actually not even that good for what they were doing. Like they had a lot of logistical problems even during the war.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably going to continue. So I actually don't really think Germany is going to be in much of a position to go to war against Japan, especially since the German naval power, especially since we still have England in the fight, which pretty much crippled the
Lacking.
German Navy from the start. They're not really going to
Yes.
be in any position to actually attack Japan any more than the Soviet Union is. So if it ever did
Navally
happen,
seen.
what's up?
Navally seen, they don't stand a chance against Japan. But going off land, if I'd be Germany, I'd set up a huge camp or a huge strong point in my Soviet territory to keep an eye out on my ex or my still friend. Also, what I'd like to mention at that point is the USA is, as we know, is pretty much very they oversee a lot of things, and when they see two highly rising powers, they'll upgrade their military too. So at one point, if that what happens with us with the Soviet Union, they became too big a threat, and that's what the Americans saw, and that's why they upgraded to keep a hay and to keep somewhat of a balance and to stop any sort of maybe in the furthest theoretical way possible the Soviet Union invading the USA. If you see where I'm going with that.
Yeah, I got you. Well, the thing is, I'm actually kind of relying on, like, what I'm relying on to happen here, or what I'm expecting to happen, is that, let's say the Germans manage, or let's say the Axis managed to take out the Soviet Union, and I'm proposing they probably still are not going to be able to take England, especially since once the Soviet Union falls, by that time I think it's pretty implausible that America stays completely out of the war. So I think we'll say like the Anglos and the Americans are still going to be in it. The Japanese are going to be in control of, let's say, well, most of what they were historically in control of, right? And we'll say the Germans have a reasonable, well, I mean, basically things look like what they looked like before before the Allied like liberation of France. So at that point, what I'm saying is that it's just not clear how, like, it's not clear who in that situation is going to have any wise option of attacking the Japanese. Because the Germans are not going to be able to do it because they're already stretched way too thin, just like they were historically. The Allies aren't going to be able to do it because, well, because they're already because they're basically already in a corner. So it looks like it's really improbable if just a few, like, let's say the Japanese go ahead and follow Hitler, they go ahead and attack the Soviet Union. Assuming that that goes well, it seems really improbable that Japan is going to find itself losing the war or having things turn against it in the near future, like within the next couple of decades, probably. And I would consider that to be a pretty unequivocal win, because we're talking about like major acquisition of territory, we're talking about military victory, we're talking about removing foreign powers from their sphere of, like, that would be pretty clearly a Japanese victory, even if there are problems with the strategic situation afterwards, which there would be, well, which there always, like, every country has like strategic concerns.
Okay. A point I'd like to touch on, which you actually mentioned yourself, the German logistics were horrible, and they sucked at any point, and they only made it to have not even like a third of Russia, by the best. It would have taken them a few weeks, and I'm still on the point that you're under mass. You're under fuck. I can't say the word. You're underestimating the Soviet Union very much. They pounded Germany. They are still pretty much on equal eye with the USA. So if you, let's say we're going off the 1942, beginning 1943. The Germans have now made it up to about a third of Russia. Now slowly getting into the deep forest part. And the Japanese decide, okay, they've did their move, we're gonna make our move up too.
Okay, wait, hold
The
up.
Russians
I just want
have
to be real quick, because I think you're sort of misrepresenting, or you're misunderstanding what I'm saying. So what I'm proposing is the Japanese, like I'm pretty sure the Germans were trying to get them to do at the time, is the Japanese and the Germans are going to attack simultaneously or in quick succession. And what that's going to do is it's going to make it a lot harder for the Soviets to muster as much force as they were able to historically against the Germans.
Mhm.
Another thing is you talk about Germany only managing to get a third of the way into Russia. That's true. But that 1/3 of Russia is like the industrial base of Russia. It's where most of the Russian population is. It's where the seat of Russian government is. And if the Germans can
Mhm.
take that, like if the Germans can take like Stalingrad and Leningrad, I don't really
But they
see.
failed at Stalingrad.
Yeah, they did fail. I'm saying if they can succeed at that,
Mm.
they don't necessarily have to like conquer or occupy every village in like Central Asia. But if they can manage to take European Russia, I don't really see how the Soviets are going to be able to bounce back, especially if the
Well,
Japanese are also occupying like Siberia.
yeah. A point I'm gonna make now is the Germans mustered up 3 million soldiers, which how many returned? Maybe 10 to 100,000. The Japanese don't have in any way. They don't have as much. They it's so unlikely. It's I would call it impossible for the Japanese ground force pummeling that piece of Soviet territory. They might get in, but they're going to be pummeled back out. Even though the Russians got a huge amount of casualties on the German side, the Russians have shown since their break from the monarchy that if they want, they have the possibility to pound the enemy. They've shown it against the Germans, they've shown it against the USA, and showing it against the USA is pretty much okay, you got my respect. Also, um, it's pretty much 1942, right? So the right as Germany is going into Russia, you know what the Russians did? They moved all their um, all their factories, all their manufacturing to the more Siberian, more eastern. So everything that comes out of there can put directly against the Japanese, and because it's like they're right, they don't have to move a lot. The Japanese are on the island. They first have to get their troops logistically to the mainland, to China, and then move them up to Russia. Also, the Chinese, I would rather suggest that they're not so much familiar with the conditions, the climate conditions, the weather all that with all those conditions with the from the Russians. What the Germans also underestimated, where a lot of German soldiers died through freezing to death or other weather conditions.
Okay.
So
Well,
the likelihood of that scenario, which you said, is pretty much it is impossible.
yeah. So a point that I actually wanted to bring up, in which you mentioned, was that when the Soviet Union was fighting their war against Germany, a lot of their logistics was coming from the east, like it was coming from the far east around like Siberia. And one of the reasons why I think this pincer strategy has a chance of working is because if that territory is put under threat, then the Soviet Union actually can't, like their logistical strategy that they actually pursued, they can't do that anymore. Especially if the Japanese actually manage to take Siberia, which they have actually a reasonable chance of doing. Since the Soviets are going to put everything that they have, they're going to have to put everything they have into repelling the Germans from like Stalingrad. If they can't do that, if they don't put everything they have into it and they lose the Western War, then the Soviets have basically lost the war right there.
Now there's a question I want to ask that. we're talking now 1942, aren't we? Right? We're in the middle of ending like October 1942, right? About that.
Okay.
At that point, I know you said that the Japanese wanted to say or keep the Americans out, but seeing as Japan is a threat to them, I would bet 100% that at that point the Americans know, because they're not stupid. They may seem a little bit weird, but they're not stupid. That Japan and Germany are a big threat. They would start supplying Russia at the end, even so. They would supply them. And your theory is just going based off them not, but the likelihood that they would have not is in not in the 0%. I'd say, because if I'm the global leader, I'm a global country, and I see two Willies attacking a Fred, and I'm not quite the fan of Fred, but oh, a perfect saying. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's what the Americans would have done and have shown to do.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So I agree with you that the United States can't be kept out of the war forever. But the question is whether or not the United States intervenes fast enough to stop the Soviet Union from falling. And what I'm saying is that if that doesn't happen, which it has a pretty good chance of not happening, especially since things can start going really fast, uh, especially like the Eastern Front. It like history moved pretty fast there, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not obvious to me that the United States is going to be able to notice the Soviet Union losing and somehow react fast enough to stop that from happening. Especially since my guess is that in the absence of a Pearl Harbor, the United States is going to be like navally inferior to Japan, right? So there's not going to be much option of doing much in the Pacific. The only thing they can really do is work with the British to attack on the Western Front, but that's less likely to succeed.
Um, so 2 points I want to go again after is uh, do you know how strong you could say the ground body of the Japanese army was? It was it was as weak as the Italian, and we all know how the Italians suck.
Yeah,
It
I,
was at that level, and that's where the Russians had a pretty good tank even before the T-34. They had the KV-1s, and that KV-1 can take a shit ton of punishment. Also, you're not taking into account that the USA at that point is a freak of nature when it comes to logistics and supplying. And we saw that what they did in the world in historically seen World War II. They supplied Russia through the West. They could have also supplied, even though it was through due to weather around Russia being not as good, they could have taken that risk in sending their supplies through a upper route to the Baltic Sea or to a yeah, pretty much to the Baltic Sea to supply Russia from there. And also, the Americans do have, I think it's from Alaska, a little bit more left. They do have two pretty, let's say, medium-sized islands, which the Japanese historically actually attacked and invaded, but then they just abandoned them. Um, they could use those as a sort of mini point to navigate. But the the Russians would have pummeled the land force of the Japanese. That's just how it would have ended, and then they
Okay,
could have
so
put all their focus to the Germans. Also, the Americans, I believe, and I bet, could easily supply both the UK and Russia on both sides, through the west, through the east.
all right, so I'm gonna go ahead and agree with you that the Japanese infantry is not gonna fare that well against the Soviet. Well, yeah, like the Japanese ground forces are not gonna fare that well.
The
I
Navy
think
is gonna
that's
beat them easily. I'll give you that point. That the Navy of the Japanese was quality wise probably the best, but they didn't have the quantity to muster up against the U.S. historically. But the land-based troops. So,
yeah. But if you look at sort of the geography that we're talking about with Siberia, which is the location in question, I think the Navy is actually going to be, if not as important as the Army. The naval dynamics aren't something that you can dismiss, and I think all that's really necessary to at least possibly upset the way things went on the way things went with the German invasion. All that's really necessary is just to put pressure on the Soviets in Siberia. And if we also look at the Japanese whole, like the Japanese also had forces in China. They can at least plausibly threaten other parts of Russia. And what would happen in this scenario is just like how the Germans had to fight a two-front war against the Soviets and the Anglo-American and the Western Allies. Here, the Soviets are going to be put in that position of having to defend. And even though I think the Soviets can, I would agree, the Soviets can prevent the Japanese from invading from the west or from the east. And they can also manage to stop the Germans, just like they historically did, with reasonable amounts of American help with supplies. It's not obvious that they're going to be able to do both at the same time, especially if we're talking about a situation where the United States is going to be less committed to the war due to not having suffered Pearl Harbor.
okay, then I'm gonna do
And
a
that's
hypothetical like you did.
okay.
Let's say the Russians say, okay, USA, we're gonna lend a shit ton of supplies. We'll repay you, no problem. You supply me. They supply them, and the Russians focus all of their shit on the Japanese, hitting them out, making them KO from for the Pacific, making it easier for the US to supply them. Then
But
they
see,
can focus all their might to the Germans.
well, why is it that the Germans are just going to sit there and watch that happen though?
Sure, but that's where the argument from before comes. The Germans had hard logistic problems. Also, you're gonna have pressure from the UK, so they still have to fight a war on both fronts, and they lost that historically. So they have to muster up some power to go against the rebellions in France and the British, but also muster up enough energy to push a little bit into Russia, which is hard because all of their equipment isn't made for that territory. A shit ton of people died. A shit ton of tanks and other equipment just froze and was unusable. So they can't muster up that 100% energy.
Yeah. I mean, if you
Which,
look, this is the point. If you look at what Stalin seemed to think before before the Japanese or before the Americans entered the war, basically, it doesn't seem like Stalin thought that he could afford to focus only on one side or the other. was seriously concerned with the possibility of an attack either from the east or from the west. And I think he was right to be, because an attack from either of those directions can cripple the Soviet Union and eventually lead to them being defeated.
That's what that's what happened historically. Also, the
Well,
the Russians did have some fights with the Japanese, and that's what Stalin did. I will almost want to say Putin. He stationed troops at the border to China or just to the Japanese, so the Japanese would rethink or reconsider going against big Russia. Also, don't forget, Russia is so effing big. It
okay.
has a huge population. And it's pretty. I'll also compare them to somewhat of the Japanese morals of never give up. I think that's also anchored pretty deeply in the Russian roots.
Well, I mean, so Russia is pretty big, but like I was saying earlier, a lot of the actual, well, actually, if you look at the actual situation in World War II, what we have is we have a situation where a lot of the Russian industry and logistics was in Siberia, but then the center of population and the center of government is uh, is in the West. And both of those areas, like I don't actually think that it's really going to matter whether anybody can occupy. Like I don't think anyone is going to be able to occupy the whole territory of the Soviet. But that's not necessary to take it out of military relevance, which is kind of similar to what happened to Russia in World War One. Actually, like nobody, I don't know that Russia has ever been conquered since the Mongols, but Russia has still lost plenty of wars.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's all I'm saying. I think Russia could, or the Soviets could easily lose, or could be made militarily irrelevant without necessarily being conquered. Anyway, it looks like we're about to come up on the hour mark, so
Oh
it might be
shit! You
time.
have a you have a debate with Cooldown,
Well,
don't you?
I mean, we don't have to. It's not like we're on that tight of a time crunch, but we might go
Yeah.
ahead and move to closing statements.
Okay, well, something I still like to point out. So let's say it worked and Japan and Germany made so much damage that the Russians can't really muster up enough to really repel them anymore. There will still be enough territory for them to at least do some how did the Americans call it again? They what the Vietnamese did. They did these booby traps and all that stuff. That strategy. I know you probably know what I mean, but I can't figure out
Like
the
guerrilla
word.
warfare, you mean?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. They would pretty much turn to guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, I think so too. But I think that's going to be. Honestly, I think a lot of that is going to be more of a problem for the Germans than for the Japanese.
Hmm.
Like, I think
Sure.
that's. With the Japanese, I think the Japanese are also going to have some trouble. Let's say that World War II just ends and it somehow ends on the Axis favor. Japan isn't necessarily going to be able to like maintain control over all the land that they've taken over just forever without having to like withdraw.
Mm.
But they're going to be able to maintain sort of like a sphere of influence, and they're going to be able to acquire resources from East Asia, and
I've uh,
they're going to be in a much better situation than they were before the war. And I think the Germans, like the problems that the Germans are going to have, is actually going to come out in Japan's favor, because, like you were saying, it's going to make it a lot harder for Germany to ever start threatening Japan or encroach on the Japanese territory.
I have one last question to ask you. By going back to my argument with the resources, Do you think the Japanese can just rely on that Chinese on those Chinese resources to go against big Russia? And also, Russia showed that they can use pretty much all their natural resources and pull them from everywhere. Um, and the Japanese relied not they couldn't rely just on China. That's why they attacked historically the Dutch East Indies. Just as a I'd just like to mention that for your theory of being it's just so unlike it's pretty much impossible that it would happen. But yeah, we can go, I think we can head to closing statements now.
Okay, cool. So I'll go ahead and agree with you. I think that there is going to be a problem with Japan's access to natural resources, at least at the beginning. But I don't think that that's necessarily going to be fatal to their chances of winning the war. I think that if you look back to the Japanese situation, we'll say around, we could even take it back a little bit further if we really wanted to, and look at some of the options that the Japanese might have had around 1939, say. There's a whole lot of different strategic moves the Japanese could have made. They could have declined to ever prosecute a war against the United States. They could have waited or, delayed the American entry into the war as long as possible. They could have pursued a more aggressive strategy against the Soviet Union. They could have just been less aggressive in general, or they could have there's a few sort of different strategic moves the Japanese could have made. And I think if we look at the many options that seem to have been available, I don't think it's 100% fair to say that the Japanese didn't have a chance at winning the war. I think if they would have had, one thing we didn't get into also is that like the decision making or the way that they were making decisions wasn't so great. If they would have thought a little bit better about the way they go about things, I think that there were strategies that could have been taken that had, at least to me, a reasonable chance at seeing Japan come out on top in World War II.
Okay. My closing statement is going to be just based on the location of Japan, it being an island. It's hard to muster up any power from themselves. They have to rely on, and they still heavily rely on today, on resources from other countries, just now that they import it and buy it and don't go to war to get it. Um, it's just it for Japan winning the war, it would have to be more mainland. It would have to have some resources of its own, and those resources sh- would have to be in a place which isn't occupied by any country that poses a threat or is allied with a threat to Japan. But even though then Japan's only real power was their naval fleet, and that they did have one that was pretty good, that alone will not win you a war. And especially not a big World War II.